The rape of Nanking is the topic that we're looking at today in these slides, but nothing happens in a vacuum. Our relations with one another don't really happen in a vacuum, and this didn't happen in a vacuum either. There were things that led up to it. There was a first Sino-Japanese war. This particular incident took place during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Before December 1937, it'd be interesting to take a look at what was going on in China and Japan to give us a little bit of a background. This was all about Korea. The first war was in 1894 and 95. China, for its part, Korea had long been a client state, but Japan, Korea was only 133 miles from its shore. Korea was an entrance onto the mainland. Korea had natural resources of coal and iron. There were some incidents that happened prior to our time, and it became in 1875 a fact that Korea was independent in foreign trade, especially with Japan. And in 1884, a Lee-Ito agreement between Japan and China was to remove all troops from Korea, from both countries. China was conservative. It had a tendency to be isolationist. Japan, on the other hand, was into modernization, and they see Chinese troops in Korea at this point as a violation of that Lee-Ito agreement. Therefore, in 1894, 10 years after the agreement, war was declared. Japan entered modernized, equipped, and prepared. Though people expected China to do better because of their larger number, they did not do well. They were not well equipped. 1 year later, they sued for peace. Also, before the date that we're really looking at, in China's column, China had to give Japan trading privileges on its property. Things had gotten pretty desperate in some areas for China. But Russia, the communists in Russia, they fear Japanese expansion, so they're trying to get China on board with them. A reform movement was begun in the country. And in July 1934, the communists said that they would help against Japan. And they went about organizing some villages and made up some self-defense units. On Japan's side, they had been given a large sum from China when China had to sue for peace. And they had to return the Liaodong Peninsula. 1905, Korea became a protectorate, and in 1910, Japan annexes Korea. Now, they have a foothold in the continent, and they're going to be accessing raw material and going into Manchuria. So now we have a beginning of a look at the Second Sino-Japanese War. Again, in China's column, there's little resistance to Japan's taking of Manchuria. And in Japan's column, they had taken charge of that area. In both columns, we see the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July of 1937. This was a trigger for both countries. There was a rising tide of nationalism in China, which Japan found intolerable for what they wanted to do. The Chinese armies lost Shanghai, and so they went on to Nanking. On the China side, the leader, the president, Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists had a united front against the Japanese. But the initial losses were to the better equipped Japan. During the time that we're looking at, what is sometimes called the massacre of Nanking, we're calling the rape of Nanking. In China, President Chiang Kai-shek left the capital on December 7th. China was wary of Japan since their conquest of Manchuria. There never was a lot of trust there. And even though they had tried to keep away from the communists, they were forced to ally with the communists that they had been fighting so that they could have their help against Japan. They wanted to preserve their troops. Chiang Kai-shek wanted to preserve his troops. So he takes the best and he moves into the interior with the thought that he would draw the Japanese into the interior and it would be a war of attrition, which was not how it turned out. The military, after their losses, especially in Shanghai, were ill prepared. In Japan, they were pleased with the taking of ports along the coast and now of Shanghai, and the troops were really wanting to just take down the capital of Nanking. Supporting Japan against China was Germany, later to include Italy, in what they called an anti-Comintern pact, which was really an anti-communist pact. And the leader in Japan, Matsui, who could have restrained his troops and asked them to restrain their forward movement, didn't have any power over them. And so after Shanghai, the troops moved quickly towards Nanking. One of the ironies of the war is that Matsui, who we're going to see is in charge of the people who commit these atrocities, had actually donated money to establish a safety zone for civilians in Shanghai. These are pictures, dire pictures of the rape of Nanking. In December 1937 to January 1938, atrocities that you don't even want to mention were committed. Some of the ladies who had been survivors made recordings, and they talked about how the Japanese forcibly kicked a daughter away from this little girl's mother and hurt her badly, and the little girl had to protect her sister and clean her wounds. And then they raped mama and aunt, and they left, and the family just kept weeping. Horrible, horrible stories. Interestingly, during the rape of Nanking, there was, for us in the United States, something very interesting, another irony of the war, because there was a Nazi whose name was John Rabe, who saved thousands of lives of the Chinese. When Chiang Kai-shek left with some of the finer troops and headed towards the interior of the country, he left John Rabe and some of the other foreigners, not very many were left, to head up what they called the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone. Rabe made an unsuccessful attempt for a 3-day ceasefire, and that didn't work out. And Germany was still operating under the Comintern Pact with Japan, and the hope was this would help him. because he's German. On December 13th, there were 500,000 non-military, non-combatants that were in the shelter that he provided. Still, there were raids on the periphery of this shelter, and people were taken out and killed. And some of the military who had tried to meld back into the shelter by taking off their military uniforms and putting on civilian clothes, anybody who looked like they may be part of the military were taken out. Sometimes hundreds would be taken out and women would be raped brutally. People were shot. In the upper right-hand corner, you see an actual picture of the safety zone, a street on the safety zone. And interestingly, down below, you'll see the Nazi flag, which seems so anathema to those of us in the United States, but it was this flag, when the Japanese flew over, that kept them from bombing this safety zone. Directly from his diary, it says, last night, up to 1,000 women and girls are said to have been raped, about 100 girls at the Gingling Girls' College alone. You hear nothing but rape. If husbands or brothers intervene, they're shot. What you hear and see on all sides is the brutality and the bestiality of the Japanese soldiers. Following the rape of Nanking, China had serious economic, social problems, refugees, bad roads, bombed cities, inflation, a demoralized army. And yet Chiang Kai-shek refuses to surrender or negotiate with the Japanese. There's internal civil war. On the Japan side, they tried to subdue Chinese resistance by blockades. And you'll see by a map in a moment that they were fairly successful. They took advantage in a couple years later, in 1940, when France fell to the Germans, to expand. And they set up a puppet regime in Nanking in 1940. This is a map that goes from 1870 to 1942, but if you look at the yellow, the pink, that's Korea and Manchuria, and then to the left and south of that is the yellow. This is the occupation in 1937, an additional occupation just to the west of that in that green in 1938. These are the years that coincide with the Nanking massacre. So China after the rape of Nanking. On the left you see the former home and a statue of John Raba and the Chinese who were visiting there. On the right you see a part of the memorial of the 300,000 in Nanking that are presumed dead from the massacre. And in the bottom, you see that same picture that was in the first slide. Heartbreaking tales, haunting faces of the survivors.